Hello everyone, welcome back. Hopefully you're ready for one more video in our Spring Boot testing tutorial series. In this video we are going to be talking about integration tests. For it we have a lot of things to do, so let me just get straight into it and I will be explaining the things along the way as we go. So the very first thing that you see on my screen is this application properties file, and as you can see it's located inside of our test module, so under the resources folder. So if you don't have it, create a resources folder here, so it's just a normal folder, and inside of it create this application.properties file. So what this does, or what integration tests do, they use database. So if you have a service that uses a database, which we will create it, and when you write integration tests, you need a database for them. And to handle that, you won't be using something like MySQL, Oracle, or something like that. We are going to be using H2 database. So H2 is just a in-memory database that can serve its purpose for these tests. And this is the configuration for the H2. And if you're wondering, okay, from where does this come and everything, so if you go to the build Gradle file, you'll see that from the beginning we have this Spring Boot starter test, so this will handle our testing stuff, but we also have this H2 database. So this is where the dependency comes from, and that's why we can use H2 in our project. Okay, then I'll go back to the file one more, so if you can just copy it, create a file, copy these things and have it the same. The username and the password do not really matter, so whatever you put here is fine. Okay, great. Then let's get started. Let me close this. As you can see, I've created a folder called entity. So this is inside of our main package. There is a package or a folder, whatever, called entity. And inside of it, we are going to create two entities. We are going to create a person entity and we are going to create an address entity. Let's start with an address. So this address entity, so it's a normal Java class, but it's annotated with @entity annotation. And this address will have two properties. We'll have an ID and whatever, a name. So address doesn't really have a name, but yeah, let's just name it name. It doesn't matter. What's important here that the ID is of type string and the name is of type string also. And then let's create getters and setters for it, or for both of them. And now on the ID, we have to add some annotation. So we have to mark this as an ID so that our so that Spring knows that this is an ID of this entity. So we take this JavaX persistence annotation at ID, and then we also add generated value. So this is the way we are going to create this identity. So the strategy of how we create the identity. And yeah, that's it. If you want to know more about this, I have other tutorials where we build this Gradle application with Spring Boot, and there we go into details of how to create entities, how to create services for them, repositories, and all of that nice things. And now let's go to the name column. So it will be just a column and it will not be nullable. So you have to have this. Perfect. Now once we are done with the address entity, let's create a person entity. The person will have same things as address, so ID and the name. So let's copy actually everything from here and paste it there. And let's also copy the @entity annotation. So we're going to paste that here on top of it. But the person will also have an address. So let's add an address here. And now let's create getters and setters for the address that we just added to the person. Once we have that, we have to create the linkage in between the person and the address. So it will be many-to-one relationship. So many persons can have one address. And then let's just join the column. And we're going to join it based on the name of the table, which is just the address. Of course, if you want to change this, so if you go to the address, you can enter here at table, and then you can give it a different name if you want to. But for us, that doesn't really matter in this case. And of course, let's make this not nullable, so we always have to have an address. Perfect. Now, once we have settled that, we want to create some kind of a distributed repository. Let me create a new package. Let's call it repository. And inside of this repository package, let's create a new interface, and let's name it distributed repository. If you want to know more about these repositories and what we are exactly doing there, please take a look at my Cradle application tutorial series, where you can take a look at how we create this in detail. I will link it in the description. If you're interested, just jump to it. Okay, we want to add one more annotation here, and that's at no repository bean. So basically just that the Spring doesn't pick it up, so that it understands this is just a base class that we are using for some JPA repositories. And let's give it a type here. So this is just the type of our entity, and this will actually extend the JPA repository. And the JPA repository expects two things. It expects the type of the entity, and it expects the type of the ID. So it will be just entity, and the type of ID is a string. So the string is defined. So I know it's a string because we defined it here. The ID is of type string for both of our entities. And yeah, I think that's it for this one. Perfect. Now let's create the implementation for this. So let's create a new class, call it distributed repository impl. And so this distributed repository impl again will have a type. So entity, and it will extend a simple JPA repository. Again, simple JPA repository has a type of the entity and its ID type, so entity string, and it will implement a distributed repository, so the one that we just created with the same type entity. And let me just make this a bit more nicer so it's easier to read. And let's create a constructor, and we are going to go with this one, and here we are going to have string. Again, if I'm going too fast or something is unclear, please take a look at my other tutorial. There we go into details, how we build this and why we use it, and then we create some fancy repositories for our entities and stuff like that. Really nice things. But for our tutorials, for the purpose of integration tests, we just need something so that we can actually save entities to the database. Okay, so the next thing that we want to do is we want to create some configuration. We actually need to enable this JPA repository. To do that, we need a configuration class, and we need to add some annotations to it. So let's create, if we don't have it, which we do not, let's create a new package, and let's name it config. And inside of the config package, let's create a Java class called configuration. Or let's name it app configuration, something like that, doesn't really matter. Great, now we add two annotations. First one is at configuration, so that the Spring knows this is a configuration class, and the second one is to enable the JPA repository, which is conveniently called enable JPA repositories. Yeah, really nice. Okay, it needs two properties. It needs a value, which is basically the path to the folder, so to the package where you keep your repositories, and it also needs a repository base class, and that would be our distributed repository impl class. And the value here, the value part is basically this. So it's a package where we keep the repository. So it's this package here. So if I go back and just paste this, that would be it. And yeah, that's everything for the configuration. We don't have to touch anything there. And we have created this distributed repository, meaning it's not meant for one of the entities that we have. So each entity should have its own repository. So in this one, you would keep some things that are common, like for example, find everything by ID or whatever. It doesn't really matter. But inside of the separate repositories, you would do things that are specific to that entity. For example, you just want to search all persons by an address or something like that. You would do that inside of a person repository. You don't want that in a distributed repository, because why would you need that in some whatever vehicle entity? So why would you need to search persons by addresses? It doesn't really make sense. So you want to keep things separate. It's just a nice thing to do. And then now let's create two repositories. Let's create an address repository and a person repository. So this will be an interface, of course. And let's edit, and let's let Spring know that this is a repository, and this repository will extend the distributed repository, and the entity type here is address. And now we do the same for what's it called, the person. So we do the same for the person. We create the person repository, again an interface. And let's add repository extends distributed repository person. Perfect. We have created our repositories that we wanted to create. Now let's move on to the next thing, and that would be the services that we want to create. We want to create two services. We want to create one for one for address and one for person. So let's start with the address one. So let's go new Java class and let's name it address service. Yeah, this will be a service, so we annotated it at service, and we want to have our access to the address repository. So private this repository, because we are going to be creating addresses and saving them. And let's create the constructor with this, and let's just annotate it with @autowire so that we can inject this address repository. And let's create one method. Let's create public public address. So we're going to be returning an address here, and let's name it something like create address. And to it we're going to be passing a name. And yeah, so we create a new instance of an address class, address, and we set the name to the value that we passed in, and we use the repository to save this. So we save this entity. It's actually quite simple, so we might want to do some checks if the name is provided or not, or whatever. Make this final, all of that nice things, but I don't want to bother with it because it's not really important. I just want to show you how you can create integration tests. What are the services doing behind it? It's not really important. I need the bare bone of it, so just that we have something. Okay, let's create one more method, and to this one we are going to be passing in an ID, so an ID of an address, and then we are going to use the repository to fetch it. So again, it will be public and it will return an address, and we can name it like get address or something like that, or maybe find address, I don't know, find address, and then string ID. And to this one we're going to go again return repository dot find by ID, and then or else we just return null. Great, so we're done with our address service. Now let's move on to the new one, and let's name it person service. And again, let's annotate it with @service, and let's now inject person repository. And let's inject the address service. We'll see why in the moment. Address service, and then again the same constructor. Let's use both of them and add @autowired. Now the next thing is that we want to have a method that creates a person. So public person create person, and to this method we're going to be passing two things. We're going to pass in the person name, and we're going to be passing in the address ID. Okay, now with the address ID we want to find an address, so we're going to be using the address service dot what we did name it, find address, and we pass in the address ID, and this is our address. And if address is null, we return null. Yeah, whatever. We would log an error here or whatever in a real application, but for us it doesn't really matter. We just return null. Okay, great. Now we create a new person, and to the person we set an address, and to the person we set an ID, sorry, not an ID, so we set the name, which is the person name that we pass in, and then we use the person repository, so we return so repository.save person. Perfect. Okay, with this being done, we are ready to write some integration tests. So let me close all of this. Let's go to our test module, Java services, and then let's create a new class here. Let's name it person service integration test. Great. To make it integration test, we add this at Spring Boot test. So this will load all of the context and everything that we need. And here we auto-wire two things. We auto-wire person service, and we auto-wire what's it named? Address service. Great. Now let's create a test method. Let's name it test create person. No address. So basically what we are going to test here, we will try to create a person with an address ID that's invalid or that doesn't exist. So an address with that ID doesn't exist. So we go person service dot create person, and address ID is does not exist, and some person name. Okay. And this should return as a person, but we are asserting, so we are going to use the assertions to assert that person is null. Oops. Basically, we want to assert that this is null. Let me just add a static input for this, and because when we're creating it, if it doesn't find an address, we expect it to be null, and we just return null. Okay, let me then just copy this test. Let's paste it here, and let's rename it. Now, let's use the address service to create an address. Let's name it A1. So this is some address. Oops. And let's here add an assertion that address is not null, because we would expect it to be created. And then here we are going to be using the address.getID, and the person name is whatever, doesn't really matter. And again, we are asserting that the person is not null, and that person get address is not null, and the person get address get ID is equal to address get ID, and you could also verify the person name or whatever. It doesn't really matter. I just want to show you how to write an integration test. Yeah, basically that's everything. So all that's left is we start it and see if it works or not. And here it is. So we have our results in. Both tests have passed. Keep in mind that starting the integration tests can take some time, especially on the bigger applications. Ours is quite simple, so it doesn't take that much time, but it still takes more time to start them than the normal unit tests. Yeah, that's everything I wanted to show you. So everything that we did in this tutorial, so all of these assertions, checks, whatever, not the mocks though, are valid here. So in these tests, integration tests, we are not mocking anything. You would mock something, so you could mock some things. For example, imagine that one of your services inserts something in some cache, like for example a Redis cache. You do not have Redis when you're running the integration tests. So what you would do there is you would mock this bean or whatever it is, whatever connects to Redis. Usually in your application you would mock that, and you would have a mock implementation of that. So instead of actually inserting something into Redis cache, you would insert it in some map or something like there, and then you would mock all of the interactions that you need for your tests. So that would be one thing that you could mock. But the other things like the services, your custom services that you have, you wouldn't mock them because you can use the real implementation and really test them. Integration tests are really nice and you should have them, but you should also have unit tests where you can test the single unit. So for example, our service, that would be a single unit that you want to test. An integration test is basically an integration in between those different units. So in our case, integration test for the person service is testing the integration in between the person service and the address service that we have here. Yeah, great. So that would be everything. If you have any questions, do let me know in the comments or just send me an email. And that would be everything for this video, and I will see you in the next one.